the gavel struck. Silence filled the Old Bailey. In the dock, Catherine Wilson stood motionless, holding tight to her Bible, the image of a saint. Then the verdict. Not guilty. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. Instead, as the judge looked away, a single tiny smirk curled on her lips. It was the smile of a winner. The court saw a victim. The law saw an innocent woman. But London? London was about to realize they'd just let the devil walk free. To understand the true scale of that injustice, we have to step away from the courtroom and back into the shadow of a quiet bedroom in London, just months before the gavel fell. The case that brought Catherine Wilson to the Old Bailey wasn't a murder, but a miracle of survival. The victim was Sarah Carnell, a lonely woman who thought she had found a friend in Wilson. But friendship, to Catherine Wilson, was merely a deal where the currency was trust, and the payout was death. Sarah Carnell had been unwell. It was nothing serious, just a general sickness that required rest and care. Catherine, playing the role of the devoted nurse, offered to fetch a soothing drink from the chemist. She returned with a bottle, her face the picture of concern. She poured the liquid. She held the spoon to Sarah's lips. And in that moment, the illusion of care was shattered by the reality of liquid fire. As the fluid hit Sarah's mouth, she didn't taste medicine. She tasted the fires of hell. She spat it out instantly, the burning liquid tearing the skin from her lips and chin. The pain was immediate and blinding. It was sulfuric acid, oil of vitriol, strong enough to melt metal, let alone human flesh. As Sarah screamed, twisting on the bed, holding her burning face, she looked to her friend for help. And this is where the true horror of Catherine Wilson begins. Most people, upon realizing a mistake of this size, would panic. They would scream for a doctor, run for water, show some sign of human distress. Catherine did none of these things. She stood there, watching Sarah's pain with a terrifying cold distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, empty of shock. She simply said, "The pharmacist must have made a mistake." Let that sink in. A woman is burning in front of her, and Catherine Wilson is already planning her defense. A mistake. It was a lie so bold, so calm, that it almost defied belief. But the police weren't buying it. They arrested Wilson, charging her with attempted murder. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Sarah Carnell was alive to testify. The acid was real. The motive, a small sum of money in Sarah's will, was clear. It should have been an open and shut case. But when the trial began, Catherine Wilson used her strongest weapon, her appearance. She didn't look like a monster. She didn't look like the kind of woman who would pour acid down a friend's throat. She arrived at the Old Bailey dressed in modest black, the uniform of the grieving widow. She carried a Bible, holding it tight throughout the proceedings. She looked small, holy, and completely harmless. The jury, made up entirely of men, looked at the dock and didn't see a killer. They saw a woman who reminded them of their mothers, their sisters, their wives. They saw a poor creature who had simply been unlucky. The defense leaned heavily on this bias. They painted the picture of a tragic error. A confused woman, a careless chemist, a terrible accident. They argued that Catherine had no knowledge of what was in the bottle, that she was just a vessel for a tragedy she didn't understand. It was a story of incompetence rather than evil, and the jury was eating it up. However, there was one man in that courtroom who saw through the act. That was Mr. Justice Bramwell. He was a man of science as well as law, and he understood the physical properties of the weapon used. During the trial, he interrupted the defense with a point of logic so sharp it should have cut Catherine's story to ribbons. Bramwell pointed out a basic chemical fact: the reaction of sulfuric acid. When strong acid is mixed with water or other liquids to weaken it, as would have been done to create a drink, it creates a heat reaction. It generates heat, intense heat. If Catherine Wilson had truly been an innocent nurse pouring a bottle of medicine, she would have felt the bottle heating up in her hand. She would have felt the glass turn burning hot against her palm. It would have been physically impossible for her to pour that liquid without knowing that something was violently wrong inside that bottle. The heat was the tell. The heat was the proof of her guilt. If she felt the heat and poured it anyway, it was murder. Bramwell instructed the jury to consider this. He practically handed them the conviction on a silver platter. He told them that the mistake defense was scientifically impossible. The bottle would have warned her. But the jury didn't listen to the science. They looked at the woman. They looked at the black dress. They looked at the Bible. They looked at the tears that Catherine could summon on command. And they made a decision based not on facts, but on a social inability to accept that a woman could be capable of such calculated cruelty. They couldn't match the grandmotherly figure in the dock with the image of an acid-wielding sadist. So, they chose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. They chose to believe that the bottle hadn't been hot, or that Catherine was too simple to notice. They chose not guilty. When that verdict was read, the air in the courtroom shifted. Sarah Carnell, scarred and traumatized, watched as her attacker walked free. The message was clear. If you look the part, if you play the role of the victim well enough, you can get away with anything. Catherine Wilson walked out of the Old Bailey, not with her head bowed in gratitude, but with the quiet arrogance of a predator who has tested the fence and found a hole. This verdict was not an act of mercy. It was an act of failure. By ignoring the science, by ignoring the victim's testimony, and by falling for the visual trick of a psychopath, the jury at the Old Bailey didn't just free a woman, they signed a death warrant for her next victims. Catherine Wilson now knew she was untouchable. She knew that the law was blind to women like her, and she had a lot more nursing to do. The illusion of mercy had just empowered a serial killer to turn her attention from acid to something much quieter, much harder to detect, and vastly more deadly. The heavy oak doors of the Old Bailey swung open, and for the first time in weeks, Catherine Wilson stepped out into the open air of London. You can imagine the rush of adrenaline running through her veins. Minutes earlier, she had stood in the dock, a prisoner facing the ruin of her life. Now she was a free woman. The jury had bought the act. The judge had swallowed the lie. She had looked the British legal system in the eye and blinked last. As she walked down the stone steps, she likely felt invincible, perhaps even planning her next move, or deciding which tea shop would serve for her celebratory meal. But London has a way of cutting short a victory lap. The sky above was dark, and a cold, weeping drizzle began to slick the streets. It was the kind of rain that chills you to the bone, washing away the warmth of the courtroom and replacing it with the grim reality of the street. Catherine pulled her shawl tighter, shielding herself from the weather, her mind still buzzing with the high of her freedom. She reached the bottom step, her eyes scanning the street for a cab, ready to disappear back into the crowd. She never made it to the curb. From the shadows of the archway, a figure emerged. He wasn't a journalist looking for a quote, and he certainly wasn't a well-wisher. It was a man in a damp trench coat, his face set in a line of grim determination. This was Detective Sergeant Lincoln. To Catherine, he must have looked like a ghost, a spirit she thought she had banished with that not guilty verdict. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply stepped into her path, blocking her route to freedom. The smile that had been playing on Catherine's lips vanished instantly. The air between them crackled with a sudden, terrified recognition. She knew this man, and she knew that he wasn't there to discuss the weather. Lincoln didn't waste time with pleasantries. He reached out, not to shake her hand, but to grasp her wrist. The metal of the handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that was infinitely louder than the rain. It was a mechanical, final sound that shattered her moment of triumph into 1,000 pieces. Catherine Wilson, he likely said, his voice cutting through the noise of the street. I am arresting you for the murder of Maria Soames. The shock must have been physical. The case of Sarah Carnell, the acid, the burning mouth, the mistake. That was just attempted murder. But this was different. Maria Soames was dead. This was a capital charge. In that split second, the world flipped upside down for Catherine Wilson. The innocent nurse who had just fooled a jury was gone. In her place stood a woman caught in a trap she hadn't seen coming. The police hadn't been idle while she was playing the victim in court. While she was clutching her Bible and weeping for the jury, Detective Lincoln and his team had been digging. They had been digging up bodies. They had been testing for poisons. They had been building a case that didn't rely on a mistaken bottle, but on cold, hard toxicity. The passerby on the street would have seen a strange scene. A woman in black standing in the rain, shackled to a policeman just moments after being declared innocent. But for Catherine, the horror was total. She had walked out of the frying pan of the Old Bailey, only to be thrown directly into the fire. The freedom she had tasted for less than 5 minutes was snatched away, replaced by the crushing weight of a past that refused to stay buried. As Lincoln led her away, back toward the cells she thought she had left forever, the rain washed over her, but it couldn't wash away the truth. The devil wasn't walking free after all. She was just being escorted to a deeper circle of hell. The rain that greeted Catherine Wilson outside the Old Bailey was nothing compared to the storm that had been brewing around the name Maria Soames. To understand why the police were willing to arrest a woman just declared innocent, we must look at the relationship that formed the foundation of the prosecution's new case. It was a friendship that began with a smile and ended with a shovel. Maria Soames was exactly the kind of woman Catherine Wilson hunted. She was a widow, she was lonely, and most importantly, she was comfortable. She owned property, she had savings, and she had a hole in her life that she was desperate to fill. Catherine stepped into that hole with the skill of a master planner. She didn't just befriend Maria, she absorbed her. She became the sister Maria never had, the friend who listened to every woe, and the nurse who attended to every ache and pain. For months, the two women were inseparable. They dined together, they took walks through the London parks, and they shared the intimate secrets of their lives. Or rather, Maria shared hers, while Catherine took mental notes. Catherine made herself essential. If Maria needed tea, Catherine poured it. If Maria needed advice, Catherine gave it. If Maria felt unwell, Catherine was there with a soothing drink. It was a performance of total devotion, so convincing that Maria Soames likely died, believing she was in the arms of an angel. But beneath this mask of sisterhood lay a cold, hard calculation. Catherine had been systematically draining Maria's finances. She had borrowed money again and again. But Catherine Wilson was not a woman who believed in debts. She believed in erasing them. When Maria Soames fell ill in 1856, suffering from the same burning stomach pains and sickness that would later affect Sarah Carnell, Catherine was by her bedside day and night. She refused to let anyone else feed the invalid. She gave the medicine herself, her face a mask of concern as she poured the poison down her best friend's throat. When Maria finally died from the pain, Catherine was the chief mourner. She cried the loudest at the funeral. She wore the deepest black. And then the mask slipped. Almost immediately after the earth was thrown onto Maria's coffin, Catherine produced a document. It was a loan note, an IOU. But in a twist of breathtaking boldness, the note didn't say that Catherine owed Maria money. It claimed that Maria, the wealthy widow, owed Catherine, the poor nurse, a significant sum. It was a forgery, a crude attempt to steal from the estate of the woman she had just murdered. It was this greed, this inability to stop taking, that eventually raised the suspicions of the police. But suspicion is not proof. To convict Catherine Wilson, the police needed more than a fake piece of paper. They needed the victim to speak. And so, we find ourselves in the dead of night at a quiet London cemetery. The scene is something out of a horror story. The fog is clinging low to the ground, swirling around the ankles of the constables and the medical men gathered there. The only light comes from the flickering gas lanterns, casting long dancing shadows against the headstones. There's a heavy silence in a graveyard after dark, a silence that feels disrespectful to break. But break it they did. The sound of metal striking earth echoed through the mist. Thud, scrape, thud. The gravediggers worked in shifts, peeling back the layers of soil that Catherine had counted on to keep her secret. This was not a clean procedure. It was a grim physical battle to retrieve the truth from the grip of the earth. As the wooden lid of the coffin was exposed, the tension in the group was heavy. They weren't just looking for a body. They were looking for a molecule. When the coffin was raised and pried open, the smell of damp wood and decay filled the air. But the doctors weren't stopped. They carefully removed the remains of Maria Soames, placing them into jars and boxes to be taken to the laboratory of Dr. Alfred Swaine Taylor, the father of forensic toxicology. Catherine Wilson had bet everything on the idea that the earth would hide her sins. She believed that once a body was buried, the story was over. She didn't account for the fact that science was catching up to superstition. In the tissues of Maria Soames, preserved by the very poison that killed her, the chemists found the answer. It wasn't cholera. It wasn't natural. It was colchicum, the deadly essence of the autumn crocus. The innocent nurse hadn't just made a mistake with a bottle. She had harvested a plant, extracted its poison, and fed it to her friend spoon by spoon. The digging up of Maria Soames proved that Catherine Wilson's friendship was nothing more than a long, patient hunt before the kill. The grave had been opened, and the ghost of Maria Soames had finally pointed a finger at her killer. The grave of Maria Soames gave the police a body, but it was the laboratory that revealed the true nature of the beast. The weapon Catherine Wilson chose wasn't forged in a factory. It was picked from a garden. It was the autumn crocus, also known as meadow saffron, a delicate violet flower that dots the English countryside. To a gardener, it is a thing of beauty. To Catherine Wilson, it was the perfect partner. The extract derived from this plant, colchicine, is a poison of special cruelty. Unlike arsenic, which was the common tool of the Victorian poisoner and easily detectable, or strychnine, which caused dramatic convulsions, colchicine was a silent mimic. Its effects mirrored exactly the symptoms of the great disease of the 19th century, English cholera. It caused violent sickness, an endless burning thirst, and a slow, painful shutdown of the organs. In an era where sudden stomach illness killed thousands of Londoners every year, poisoning a victim with colchicine was like hiding a tree in a forest. It was a choice that required not just knowledge, but a terrifying degree of planning. But the horror of this poison lies not in its chemistry, but in its timeline. Colchicine does not kill quickly. It is a slow, grinding death that can take days. And this tells us everything we need to know about the soul of Catherine Wilson. She wasn't a killer who struck in a fit of rage and then ran from the scene. She was a killer who pulled up a chair. Take the case of Peter Moore. He was a sea captain from Boston, Lincolnshire, a man used to the rough dangers of the ocean. He was tough, strong, and famously careful with money. He had built up a modest nest egg, a sum that he guarded carefully. But he made one fatal mistake. He let Catherine Wilson into his home. When Mauer fell ill, conveniently shortly after Catherine began caring for him, he didn't suspect the woman smoothing his pillow. As the poison began to take hold, as his stomach turned into a knot of fire, and his throat felt like it was being scrubbed with sand, he looked to Catherine as his savior. And this is the emotional core of the tragedy. Imagine the scene in that small bedroom. The captain, reduced to a sweating, trembling wreck, crying out for water to quench the fire in his belly. And there is Catherine, holding a cup to his lips. "Drink this," she would say, her voice soft, motherly. "It will make you feel better." But the cup didn't contain water. It contained more of the very thing that was killing him. Every sip he took, every time he thanked her for her kindness, he was swallowing another dose of his own destruction. It is a betrayal so deep, it is difficult to understand. She watched him fade hour by hour. She watched the light fade from his eyes. She watched a strong man reduced to a child, and she didn't flinch. She simply waited for the pulse to stop so she could check his will. But she didn't just kill them. She owned them in their final moments. This is where the pattern of James Dixon becomes relevant, and where the true psychological horror reveals itself. James Dixon was a lodger, another man with a little bit of money and a lot of trust in his landlady. When Catherine decided it was his time to die, she employed a tactic that was as effective as the poison itself: isolation. As Dixon lay dying, his lungs fighting for air and his body racked with pain, friends and family tried to visit. They wanted to say goodbye. They wanted to bring comfort. But they were met at the door by the unmovable force of Catherine Wilson. "He is too sick for visitors," she would whisper, closing the door in their faces. "He needs his rest. I am taking care of him." She systematically cut her victims off from the world. She removed any witness who might notice that the medicine smelled strange, or that the patient seemed to get worse immediately after eating. But more than that, she ensured that she was the center of their universe. In their final hours, when fear is at its peak, Peter Mauer and James Dixon had no one but their killer to hold their hand. They died looking into the eyes of the woman murdering them, likely believing to the very end that she was the only one who cared. This creates a chilling closeness to the murders. Poisoning is often called a woman's weapon because it is distant, You can put it in the soup and walk away. But Catherine didn't walk away. She stayed. She nursed the death she had planted. She washed the brows that were sweating from her poison. She changed the sheets soiled by the illness she caused. It requires a specific kind of disconnection to care for a body you are actively destroying. It suggests that to Catherine, these men weren't human beings with hopes, dreams, and families. They were simply livestock. They were cattle to be fattened up with trust and then killed for their hides. The suffering of James Dixon was particularly bad. Witnesses later recalled that he would howl in pain, a sound that drifted through the thin walls of the lodging house. He complained that his throat was burning, a classic sign of colchicine poisoning. He begged for relief, and Catherine gave it to him, teaspoon by teaspoon. She essentially tortured these men to death in their own beds, pretending to be a saint while doing the devil's work. And when the end finally came, when the breathing stopped and the room fell silent, Catherine didn't panic. She didn't run. She shifted instantly from nurse to thief. Before the bodies were even cold, she was often already searching through their belongings, hunting for the loan notes, the cash boxes, the wills. In the case of Marr, she famously claimed he had gifted her his money before he died, a claim that was easy to make when she was the only witness to his final breath. The poison she used was bittersweet. Some accounts of colchicine suggest a grim irony in the name, but for Catherine, the sweetness was the money, and the bitterness was entirely reserved for her victims. The use of this specific poison, the isolation of the victims, and the long drawn-out duration of the murders paint a portrait of a serial killer who thrived on control. She wanted to be the master of their fate. She wanted to decide when they ate, when they drank, and ultimately, when they died. Peter Marr and James Dixon were not just obstacles to be removed. They were puppets in a play written, directed, and starring Catherine Wilson. And until the science of forensic toxicology caught up with her in the graveyard of Maria Soames, she was the most successful and the most invisible predator in London. The sad truth is, we will never know exactly how many others died of cholera in the guest rooms of Catherine Wilson, their final words being a whispered thank you to the woman who was stopping their hearts. If the autumn crocus was the weapon, then the motive was far less poetic. It was cold, hard, dirty cash. To truly understand the monster that was Catherine Wilson, you have to stop looking at her as a nurse and start looking at her as a broke accountant with a taste for luxury and a complete lack of conscience. She didn't kill for the thrill of power or out of some twisted mercy. She killed because she treated human beings like piggy banks, vessels to be fattened up with trust, drained of their value, and then smashed to pieces when they were empty. The police investigation that followed the digging up of Maria Soames began to follow a paper trail that was just as damning as the chemical one. Detectives began to look back at every person who had the bad luck of dying in Catherine's care, and a terrifying pattern emerged. These weren't just patients. They were walking, breathing ATMs. Take the case of Mrs. Jackson, a humble woman who died in 1859. She wasn't wealthy by the standards of the rich, but she had a modest savings account, a little nest egg she had scraped together for her old age. Enter Catherine Wilson. Within weeks of befriending Mrs. Jackson, the bank withdrawals began. They started small, amounts that could be explained away as household expenses. But as Mrs. Jackson's health mysteriously declined, suffering from that familiar burning thirst and violent sickness, the withdrawals sped up. By the time Mrs. Jackson took her final painful breath, her account had been bled dry. Catherine had taken over 120 pounds, a huge sum in those days, and she didn't stop there. In a display of greed that borders on the sick, Catherine didn't just steal the money, she stole the woman's legacy. She produced a loan note, a forgery that claimed Mrs. Jackson owed her money. She was essentially billing the corpse for the cost of its own murder. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was a business model. In 1860, a woman named Mrs. Atkinson came to London from Kirkby Lonsdale. She had brought with her a considerable sum of cash intended for a surgery and a stay in the city. She made the fatal error of staying with Catherine Wilson. Within days, Mrs. Atkinson was dead, and miraculously, her purse was empty. The cash had vanished into Catherine's pockets before the undertaker had even arrived. Once again, the paperwork appeared. Fraudulent wills, fake debts, lies scribbled on paper to justify the theft. The psychology here is chilling. Most thieves rob you and run. Catherine Wilson robbed you, made you tea, watched you die, and then robbed you again. She viewed her friends not as people, but as assets to be sold. There is a terrifying logic to it. Why let a friend live if they are worth more to you dead? Why wait for an inheritance when you can speed up the process with a few drops of colchicum? She was a financial predator of the highest order. She spent money as fast as she stole it, always on the hunt for the next investment. Mrs. Jackson and Mrs. Atkinson were simply items on a list that only Catherine could see. She stripped them of their health, their dignity, and finally, their net worth. It turns out that the angel of death didn't work for free. She charged a very high price for her services, and she collected payment in full from the pockets of the dead. The detectives realized that they weren't just hunting a killer, they were hunting a parasite that consumed its host completely, leaving nothing behind but a shell and a zero balance. The paper trail exposed the greed, but the prosecution needed more than stolen banknotes to hang a woman. They needed to prove that the deaths were not natural tragedies, but calculated executions. To do that, they had to do something that seemed impossible to the Victorian mind. They had to reach back across the years, through the barrier of the grave, and find a poison that leaves no mark on the skin and mimics a stomach bug. Enter Dr. Alfred Swaine Taylor. In 1862, Taylor was not just a witness, he was a celebrity of the scientific world. He was the father of forensic toxicology, the man who was dragging criminal investigation out of the dark ages and into the light of the laboratory. When he stepped into the witness box at the Old Bailey, the atmosphere shifted. Catherine Wilson, who had used her tears and her Bible to charm the previous judge, froze. She was looking at the one man in London she couldn't trick. The defense was confident. They knew that Maria Soames had been buried for 6 years, 6 years of decay, 6 years of damp earth soaking into the coffin. They argued that any chemical trace would have long since vanished, returned to the soil. They were betting on the limits of science. But Dr. Taylor had a surprise for them. He detailed his process to a quiet courtroom. He hadn't just looked at the remains. He had subjected them to a rigorous, brutal chemical analysis. He described how he had taken the organic matter, tissue that most men would turn away from in disgust, and broken it down, searching for the specific chemical trace of the autumn crocus. It was a search for a needle in a haystack, where the haystack was rotting and the needle was microscopic. But he found it. Taylor testified with the cool precision of a surgeon that he had isolated colchicine from the remains of Maria Soames. He explained that this substance does not occur naturally in the human body. It is not a result of decay. It is not a result of soil mixing. Its presence in the stomach of the victim could mean only one thing: it was swallowed. The impact of this testimony cannot be overstated. For centuries, poison had been the perfect crime. It was invisible. It was quiet. If you could get the body in the ground, you were safe. Catherine Wilson had operated on this ancient rule. She believed that the earth was a vault that kept its secrets forever. Dr. Taylor shattered that belief. He stood there, holding the scientific proof that the dead do speak, provided you have the right language to listen. He demonstrated that no matter how deep you dig the hole, no matter how many years pass, science can still find the truth. As Taylor spoke, the innocent nurse in the dock began to shrink. The black dress and the holy act didn't work on him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the data. For the jury, this was a revelation. It wasn't just about Maria Soames anymore. It was about the terrifying realization that technology had finally caught up with the killers. The shadow of the autumn crocus, cast by a woman who thought she was smarter than everyone else, had been lit up by the harsh, unforgiving light of forensic science. Catherine Wilson wasn't just fighting a legal battle. She was fighting the future, and she was losing. The silence that followed Dr. Taylor's testimony was the sound of a noose tightening. The defense tried to argue. They tried to fight about soil samples and decay, but the ghost of Maria Soames, summoned by the science of toxicology, was now standing in the center of the courtroom. The jury didn't need long. When they returned to the box, they didn't look at the weeping woman in the dock. They didn't look at her Bible or her black dress. They looked straight ahead, their faces set in the grim mask of duty. Guilty. The word hung in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. And in that moment, the smirk that had defined Catherine Wilson's previous trial vanished. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking not like a pious widow, but like a cornered animal. She had played the game of sympathy and lost. She had played the game of science and lost. Now there were no more cards to play. Mr. Justice Biles reached for the square of black silk on his desk, the black cap. The ritual was ancient, terrifying, and final. As he placed it on his head, the courtroom seemed to shrink, the entire weight of the British Empire focusing down on the woman in the dock. But when Justice Biles spoke, he didn't just deliver a sentence. He delivered a speech on the nature of trust and betrayal. He looked down at Catherine, his voice trembling not with age, but with a deep, righteous anger. He stripped away her titles. She was no longer a nurse. She was no longer a friend. She was, in his eyes, a monster that threatened the very fabric of society. He spoke of the special horror of her method. To kill a stranger in a dark alley is a crime of violence. But to kill a friend in the safety of their own bedroom, to sit by their side and hold their hand while you feed them death, that is a crime of the soul. He pointed out that she had turned the most sacred human act, caring for the sick, into a weapon of mass destruction. She had watched the pain of her victims, not with pity, but with the cold calculation of a spider watching a fly. Then came the words that would echo through London for decades, the words that turned this trial from a murder case into a national warning. Justice Biles leaned forward, his eyes staring into hers, and declared that if such a crime were to go unpunished, If a woman could use the mask of friendship to murder for profit, then civilization itself was in danger. God forbid, he thundered, that it should be found that there is any poison so subtle that it cannot be traced. He was speaking to the room, to the press, and to every potential poisoner hiding in the shadows of the city. He was saying that the age of the invisible murder was over. But then he cut to the bone of the matter. He said that if Catherine Wilson were allowed to live, no person can sit down to a meal in safety. That was the line that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. It brought the horror home. It wasn't about dark alleys or rough neighborhoods. It was about the tea on your table. It was about the soup served by your housekeeper. It was about the medicine given by your wife. Biles was voicing the collective nightmare of the Victorian age, that the danger wasn't out there, it was right here, smiling at you from across the dinner table. He sentenced her to hang by the neck until dead. And as the final words, "And may the Lord have mercy on your soul," faded into the heavy air, there was no weeping from the gallery. There was no outrage. There was only a deep, collective sense of relief. The witch was dead. The nurse had been unmasked, and for the first time in years, the people of London felt they could accept a cup of tea from a friend without wondering if it would be their last. The gavel came down, not with a clack, but with the loud finality of Judgment Day. Catherine Wilson was finished. The sentence of Mr. Justice Biles was not just words on a page. It was a countdown. And when that countdown reached 0 on a cold October morning in 1862, the streets outside Newgate Prison had transformed into a living, breathing thing. London had turned out in force to see the end of the woman who had poisoned their trust. 20,000 people. It is a number that is hard to visualize, but easy to hear. The crowd was a crushing ocean of people, stretching as far as the eye could see. They hung from windows, they climbed lamp posts, and they crushed against the fences. It wasn't a solemn gathering for justice, it was a carnival of death. The air was thick with the smell of gin, tobacco, and the sweat of a mob that had waited all night for the main event. They wanted to see the angel of death fall. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a mix of noise, jeers, whistles, and screams that battered against the stone walls of the prison. But in the center of this storm of noise, there was a terrifying eye of calm. Catherine Wilson. When she stepped onto the scaffold, stepping out of the prison shadows and into the gray morning light, she didn't cringe. She didn't tremble. Most prisoners, when faced with the rope and the shouting mob, would collapse. They would cry, they would beg for mercy, or they would scream their innocence to the heavens. Catherine did none of these things. She walked with a steady step, her posture straight, her face a mask of total coldness. This was the final chilling revelation of her character. There was no regret in her eyes. There was no flicker of guilt for Maria Soames or Mrs. Jackson or the men she had tortured in their own beds. As she looked out at the sea of 20,000 faces screaming for her death, she didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed. The psychological profile of a psychopath is defined by a lack of feeling and an inability to accept responsibility. And on that scaffold, Catherine Wilson wore it like a badge of honor. She wasn't sorry she had killed them. She was only sorry that the game was over. She was only sorry that she had been caught. The hangman, the famous William Calcraft, worked quickly. He strapped her arms. He positioned her on the chalk mark of the trapdoor. Even the executioner, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, must have been unsettled by her coldness. She didn't offer a final prayer. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply stood there, a statue of ice in a world of fire. Then came the white cap. It was pulled down over her face, turning out the light, hiding that smirk forever. For the first time, she was in total darkness. The rope was adjusted around her neck, the rough hemp settling against the skin. A hush began to ripple through the crowd, starting at the front and rolling back like a wave. The jeers turned to a held breath. 20,000 people went silent, waiting for the sound. Click, boom. The trapdoor fell away. The body of Catherine Wilson dropped into the void. The rope snapped tight with a sickening thud that echoed off the prison walls. The woman who had silenced so many others was finally silenced herself. She didn't struggle. She didn't fight. She simply ceased to be. As her body swayed gently in the damp river breeze, the crowd erupted once more, a release of tension that shook the ground. But even as they cheered, there was a lingering sense of unease. They had killed the woman, but they couldn't kill the fear she had planted. Catherine Wilson had shown them that the devil doesn't always have horns. Sometimes she has a medicine spoon and a comforting smile. The greatest criminal that ever lived, as her own lawyer had privately called her, was dead. But in the shadow of the gallows, as the spectators began to disperse back to their homes and their tea tables, everyone knew that London would never be quite the same again. The age of innocence was over. The age of the poisoner had officially begun. The gallows of Newgate have long since been destroyed, and the roar of that crowd has faded into the hum of modern London. But the story of Catherine Wilson remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we trust the most. She forced the world to realize that a comforting smile can hide a deadly intent. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of Victorian crime. If you found this investigation fascinating, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.